Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Office Hours Politics Edition. I'm your host, Sienna Ali, and I recently read a short, fascinating book by Carl Jung called The Undiscovered Self. And while he is obviously a known psychologist and not a political theorist, one of the most interesting parts of the book is how he emphasized the relationship between the individual, religion, and the modern state. And it got me thinking about something political theorists have debated for centuries. Why have states historically feared religion? At first glance, religion and political authority seem like they should work together. For most of human history, they actually did. Kings ruled by divine authority. Empires justified expansion through religion. Governments relied on religious institutions to reinforce moral order. But at the same time, religion has always been one of the biggest threats to political authority, because religion creates something incredibly powerful, a loyalty that is higher than the state. And when people believe they answer to God or a moral law above politics, governments lose their monopoly on authority. So today we're going to break this down. We are going to talk about Carl Jung and the psychological dilemma of religion, why religion historically challenges political authority, the rise of the secular state, why authoritarian regimes fear religion, why liberal democracies try to privatize it, and why this tension still exists today. Because the relationship between religion and state isn't just theoretical, it shapes politics all over the world. Religion as a psychological power. To understand why religion can threaten political authority, we need to start somewhere unexpected: psychology. Carl Jung believed that modern societies made a huge mistake. He argued that the modern world tried to replace religion with ideology, science, and state authority. But according to Jung, religion wasn't just a set of beliefs, it served a psychological function. It gave individuals meaning, moral compasses, identity, a connection to something larger than themselves. When religion disappeared, Jung argued people don't suddenly become purely rational citizens. Instead, they begin to project the same spiritual need onto a political system. And this is where things become dangerous, because politics begin to take on religious characteristics. Ideologies become sacred. Leaders become these magical figures, and political movements demand absolute loyalty. He saw this clearly in the 20th century with totalitarian movements like Nazism and Stalinism. When traditional religion declines, the state begins to occupy that psychological space. But here's the problem. Religion historically placed limits on power. If there's a higher moral authority than the state, the governments cannot claim total control over human life. So when states replace religion, there are no limits. Political theorists often talk about legitimacy. Legitimacy means the belief that authority is justified. For a government to function, people have to believe it's right to rule. Max Weber famously identified 3 types of legitimacy: traditional authority, charismatic authority, and legal rational authority. But religion introduces a 4th possibility: divine authority. And this is where the tension begins. Because when religious authority exists, the state no longer has the highest power in society. People may obey laws, but they also believe there's a higher moral order. This creates an interesting political problem. What happens when laws contradict religious morality? Historically, this has led to civil disobedience, religious resistance movements, and political revolutions. Think about some of the most powerful political movements in history. The American Civil Rights Movement. Much of it was deeply religious. Martin Luther King framed civil rights as a moral, spiritual struggle, not just a legal one. Colonial resistant movements, anti-colonial leaders frequently use religious language to challenge imperial authority, because religion can mobilize people in ways that purely political arguments often cannot. It gives resistance a moral foundation, and governments understand this very well. Now, if you look at authoritarian regimes throughout history, one pattern appears over and over again. They try to control religion or eliminate it entirely. Why? Because authoritarian systems depend on total loyalty to the state, but religion introduces an alternate authority. In Soviet Union, the communist government aggressively suppressed religion. Churches were closed, religious leaders were persecuted. Why? Because communism wanted to create a new ideological faith. The state became the ultimate authority. The same thing happened during the French Revolution. Revolutionaries tried to replace Christianity with the cult of reason. They understood that if people continued to believe in a higher authority, higher than the revolutionary government itself, political control would always be limited. Jung actually warns us about this. He argued that the modern mass states attempt to dissolve the individual into the collective. But religion strengthens the individual's consciousness. It reminds people that they are morally responsible for their actions, even if the state demands obedience. That is incredibly threatening to authoritarian power. Now, here's where things get interesting. Even liberal democracies are uncomfortable with religion. They approach the problem differently, though. Instead of suppressing religion entirely, liberal states try to privatize it. Religion becomes something that belongs in the home, the church, private life, not in a public sphere. Why? Because liberalism is built on the idea that politics should operate within neutral rules. The state claims to represent all citizens equally, regardless of their beliefs. But if religious arguments enter political debates, they introduce moral claims that transcend democratic compromise. Political philosopher John Rawls calls this the public reason. He argues that political arguments in democratic societies should rely on reasons that all citizens can potentially accept. Religious arguments, he believed, do not meet this requirement. So liberal democracies try to separate religion and politics, but the separation is never complete. Because religion is not just a belief system, it shapes identity, values, and moral perspectives, which inevitably influence politics. Now, many political theorists in the 20th century believed that modernization would lead to secularization. In other words, religion would gradually disappear from politics, but that prediction turned out to be wrong. Religion remains a powerful force in global politics. From political movements in the Middle East to debates about secularism in Europe to the evangelical influence in American politics, religion continues to shape political conflict. And Jung might argue that this persistence reflects something deeper about human psychology. The need for meaning, identity, and moral purpose cannot simply be eliminated. If traditional religion disappears, people often replace it with ideological belief systems, which can be just as powerful and sometimes even more dangerous. So this brings us to our central question. Who ultimately holds moral authority in society? The state, religion, the individual? Carl Jung believed that modern mass societies threaten the individual. Large bureaucratic states reduce people to statistics, categories, and political units. Religion, he argued, can serve as a counterbalance. It reminds individuals that they possess an inner moral compass that no government can fully control. And this is why religion has always been politically complicated. It can support power, but it can also challenge it. Now, up until this point, we've mostly been talking about religion as something that challenges state authority. But the story actually gets more complicated. Because religion doesn't only resist political authority, sometimes it becomes political power. Throughout history, there's been political systems where religious authority and political authority are completely intertwined. Think about medieval Europe. Kings ruled under what was known as the divine right of kings. The idea was simple. Political authority came directly from God. To challenge the king was not just political rebellion, it was a spiritual rebellion. But the Catholic Church itself also held enormous political power. Popes crowned emperors, influenced wars, and shaped political life across Europe. So there was a constant tension between the two competing authorities, the state and the church. And sometimes the church actually had more legitimacy than governments. People might fear kings, but they believed in God. This is one of the many reasons why the Protestant reform was so politically explosive. When Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, he wasn't just starting a religious debate. He was destabilizing the entire political order of Europe. Suddenly, religious authority was fragmented. And once religious authority fragments, political authority becomes unstable too. Because the state can no longer rely on a single moral framework to unify society. This is actually one of the reasons modern states eventually moved towards secularism. Not necessarily because religion disappeared, but because religious conflict became so politically destabilizing that governments had to separate themselves from it. Now, this is where Carl Jung becomes incredibly relevant again. One of the biggest warnings in The Undiscovered Self is that modern societies believe they've moved beyond religion. But psychologically, he argues, humans still need systems of belief. We need narratives that give meaning to life. We need moral frameworks. We need symbols and collective identities. If traditional religion disappears, psychological needs don't disappear with it. They simply get redirected. Now, often they get redirected to politics, which we were saying was a very dangerous situation. Now, Jung believed that modern ideologies were functioning almost like substitute religions. They had sacred texts, they had moral doctrines, they had believers and heretics. They believed and demanded an absolute authority. Think about the ideological movements of the 20th. Think about the ideological movements of the 20th century. Fascism, communism, extreme nationalism. These movements did not present themselves as merely political systems. They presented themselves as total explanations of reality. They told people who they were. They told people what the future should look like. They told people who their enemies were. In other words, they filled the psychological role that religion historically played. And when politics takes on religious function, the states become incredibly powerful because it's no longer just governing people's actions, it's attempting to govern their beliefs, identity, and sense of meaning. This is why Jung believed that the individual conscious was so important. He believed when individuals lose connection with their inner moral frameworks, they become extremely vulnerable to mass political movements. They become absorbed into the collective, and the state, or ideology, becomes the ultimate authority. So the real danger of modern political systems is not simply authoritarian leaders. It's the psychology of the mass. Jung believed that modern societies encourage people to dissolve themselves into the larger collective, nation, party, ideology, movement. The larger the political structure becomes, the more the individual feels powerless. And when people feel powerless, they often seek security in collective belief systems. This is where religion can play an interesting role, because authentic religious beliefs, according to Jung, is deeply personal. It exists within the individual psyche. It cannot fully be controlled by the state. And because of that, religion can sometimes serve as a barrier against total political control. If individuals believe they answer to a higher moral authority other than the state, then political power is limited. But if individuals surrender their conscience entirely to political authority, the state becomes an absolute leviathan. And this is why Jung believed the survival of freedom ultimately depends on something surprisingly simple: the moral independence of individuals. Not just institutions, not constitutions, but people who are willing to think, question, and resist collective pressure. Because no political system, democratic or authoritarian, can remain healthy if individuals stop exercising moral responsibility. Now, before we end this episode, I want to talk about something that is often ignored when people discuss religion and politics. We usually hear about religion as a source of oppression, or religion as something that needs to be kept out of politics. But historically, religion has also been one of the most powerful tools of resistance against political power. In fact, many movements that challenged empires and authoritarian governments were deeply rooted in religious beliefs. Because religion gives resistance something very powerful. It gives people the belief that justice exists beyond political authority. And that belief can be incredibly dangerous for governments. If a state tells you that the law is the highest authority, then obedience becomes a moral expectation. But if people believe there's a higher moral law, then unjust political systems can be challenged. Think about anti-colonial movements across the world. Religion often plays a major role in mobilizing resistance. Not necessarily because religion was trying to create a theocracy, but because it gave people a moral language to challenge domination. Colonial powers actually understood this very well. In many cases, colonial governments tried to control religious institutions or reshape them. Why? Because religion had the ability to create communities that existed outside colonial authority. It gave people a shared identity, a shared moral framework, a sense that political domination was not legitimate. Even today, you see religion playing this role in many political struggles, not simply as a belief, but as identity, culture, and moral resistance. And that brings us back to something Carl Jung warned about. Jung believed that the modern world often underestimates the psychological and cultural power of religion. Political systems assume that people will simply organize themselves around institutions or the law, but human beings do not live in institutions alone. We live by meaning. When political systems fail to provide that meaning, people often turn to something deeper: religion, tradition, community, identity, which means the tension between religion and state will probably never disappear, because religion reminds people that political power is not absolute, and governments, whether democratic or authoritarian, are always uncomfortable with that reminder. So, when we ask whether religion is a threat to state power, the real answer is complicated. Religion can enforce political authority, can legitimize political authority, but it can also challenge political authority in ways that nothing else can, because it introduces a powerful idea into political life, that there may be something higher than the state. Carl Jung believed that modern societies risked losing that awareness. When individuals lose their connection to their moral conscience, they become easier to absorb into mass political movements. The state becomes stronger, the individual becomes weaker. And history has shown us when political power becomes absolute, the consequences are rarely good. So maybe the real question isn't whether religion threatens the state. Maybe the question is, should political power have limits? And if so, where do those limits come from? Religion, institutions, law, or do they come from the conscience of individuals? That's something I would love to hear your thoughts on. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay politically aware, and stay questioning your power.